It was a race with different strategy calls and a familiar podium as it matched the 2021 results, with Mercedes in the fight with Red Bull and Ferrari absolutely lost. There's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Mexico City Grand Prix. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. A class of his own and a new record. It was a weekend of dominance for Max Verstappen as he took pole and led every single lap. It was a weekend of dominance for Max Verstappen as he took the pole position and looked comfortable out at the front. And it was Red Bull's one-stop strategy that meant Verstappen won his 14th race this year and has set a new record for the most race wins in a season. And to be honest, I think the most likely outcome this year is that he wins 2 more. This afternoon in Mexico was so comfortable for Verstappen as he got off the line well on the soft tyres and managed to hold on to the lead into turn 1. From that point, it was plain sailing for the Dutchman as he held a steady gap to Hamilton, ensuring the Mercedes driver was out of DRS range. And from there, he made the right call to go onto the medium tyres, which looked pretty comfortable to run through to the end of the race. It was a strong result for him and the team, and 14 wins is an impressive achievement regardless of how many races there are in a year. As for Perez at his home race, he did an excellent job to get past George Russell on the opening lap and hold on to that position for his second home Grand Prix podium in a row. In the end, his strategy was what he needed, but he was never able to compete with and get past Lewis Hamilton for second. This result has even propelled him ahead of Charles Leclerc in the championship standings as Red Bull hunt for their first 1-2 in the championship in their history. So it can't be anything but a green box for Verstappen, Perez and Red Bull this weekend as they seem to be so strong around Mexico. Mercedes' strongest track yet. This weekend has made the fight for second in the Constructors' Championship very interesting indeed. Mercedes trailed Ferrari by 53 points coming into this weekend, and it was a great opportunity for them to close that gap to the team in second as they fight for more prize money, which would of course come with some reduced wind tunnel time for the first half of 2023. As always at this race, there was the usual challenge regarding the high altitude and the subsequent cooling challenges. Historically, through the turbo hybrid era, this has meant that the powerful Mercedes engine was nullified, and that has tended to play into the hands of Red Bull, who won at this circuit in 2017, 2018 and 2021. But in 2022, with the new aerodynamic era, everything seemed to change. Mercedes have had a difficult year, with a draggy car and a historic engine advantage that seems to have been nullified over the last couple of years. So considering the thinner air at altitude, perhaps we should have known beforehand that this could have been Mercedes' best chance at a race win. And all weekend, the team have looked very strong, with their pair topping FP3 with a 1-2, and then competing throughout qualifying, ending up second and third. It was their best performance as a team of the year by far, and they were considerably faster than Ferrari in the early stages and even on par with Red Bull. From that point it became a race of strategy, with the Red Bulls starting on the softs which gave them more pace off the line, while the Mercedes started on the medium tyres as they wanted to extend their first stint. And they started to reap the benefit of being on the medium tyres after 20 laps or so, with the Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton starting to gain on Max Verstappen. Mercedes took a risk though by going onto the hard compound tyre with both cars, giving them the option of going for the one-stop race and having more tyre life towards the end. And perhaps this risk was one step too far for the team, as both drivers were complaining on that tyre, saying the mediums were the better option. But the gamble was all about the end of the race, and the team hoping that the Red Bull's medium tyres would drop off. That of course didn't happen, and the Red Bulls looked very comfortable towards the end. But there were promising signs, with the Mercedes being the second fastest car this weekend, and that makes it 2 weeks in a row that they've been able to be up there at least for part of the race. The team probably made an error when it comes to strategy this weekend. Daniel Ricciardo made the medium to soft one-stop strategy work, and he was so fast at the end of the Grand Prix. If the Mercedes were able to match that strategy, you have to wonder what could have been for them this weekend. It'll be interesting to see if they're able to keep this form going into the next race in Brazil, which is the circuit that's at the second highest altitude on the calendar. But for me, despite this potential miss in terms of strategy, I think this weekend has been great for Mercedes as it will build their confidence going into the end of the year. So it's a green box for Mercedes this weekend. Before we look at the other side of the coin and Ferrari's awful performance, I want to take a moment to ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and leave a like on the video if you're enjoying it. Thanks. A dreadful weekend for Ferrari. Ferrari's season has been poor from a strategic perspective, but this weekend they seem to be off the pace compared to the Red Bull and Mercedes. Even during the race, the Sky commentators were suggesting that the team had turned their engine down, with the pair being so far off the pace. Perhaps the Ferrari cooling package isn't as good as their rivals, which could be a real possibility given the challenging conditions at this circuit. But it must be said that the pair were absolutely nowhere this weekend. Even Valtteri Bottas in his Ferrari-powered Alfa Romeo managed to qualify ahead of the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc on Saturday, which was a very disappointing result for the driver that's had the most pole positions in 2022. The Ferrari car itself, regardless of the power unit, also seemed to struggle this weekend. So often we saw Sainz and Leclerc bumping over the curbs between turns 7, 8 and 9, and it seemed unpredictable for them. Not only this, but earlier in the weekend, Leclerc put his car in the barriers through that same sequence of corners as he lost the rear end during FP2. For a car that, at one point this season, was a realistic contender for the championship, it was really disappointing to see how they were simply nowhere this weekend. They were left in no man's land between the top two teams and the rest of the field, and the two drivers were pretty much the only two they saw this afternoon in Mexico. Sainz ended up almost a minute behind Verstappen, and Leclerc was more than a minute behind the Red Bull winner. So it was a real challenge for that Ferrari power unit. Imagine if this race had been critical for the championship. It could have been such a huge blow for the team. As a result of this, Leclerc has dropped back behind Sergio Perez in the drivers' standings, and Carlos Sainz has dropped behind Lewis Hamilton. So it was a bad weekend on track and a very bad weekend when it comes to the standings in the championship. The Italian team will be hoping for better performances in Brazil and Abu Dhabi and will want to forget this weekend as soon as possible. So it's a red box for Ferrari and, to be honest, a very concerning result as well. Alpine's reliability issues strike again. Alpine's season has been one that's been marred by some dreadful reliability. Both drivers have had retirements for power unit issues throughout this season, and Alonso has had his fifth in Mexico. As I mentioned already, this track is one that's very tough for the power units. The high altitude and thin air means cooling is a major challenge, and it was inevitable that Alpine would be the most vulnerable team, considering the track record of that Renault engine this year. It wasn't until the closing stages that Fernando Alonso dropped out of the race, as his engine gave up after the main straight, and it was a crucial loss of points when it comes to the fight for fourth in the championship. Alpine scored just 4 points to McLaren's 8, when during the majority of the race it was Alpine that should have been outscoring their main rivals. It shows how reliability can make a massive difference, and that's something that Alpine have struggled with. Perhaps with the power unit freeze this year, the French team went all out to close the horsepower gap to their rivals and have now got to find the reliability to be more competitive in the future. The outcome in this race has meant that the points gap is now just 7 to McLaren with 2 rounds to go. So it's all to play for both teams. I have to say that if Alpine don't come fourth this year, they'll only have themselves to blame considering it's reliability that has let them down the most. So for me, even with Esteban Ocon beating Lando Norris this weekend, I think it's a red box for Alpine as they've let both drivers down this year from a reliability perspective. Ricciardo shows signs of his former self. Compared to previous weeks, Ricciardo's pace looked great in Mexico. He was actually in a reasonable position for the first time in a while, and only just off the pace of Lando Norris in qualifying compared to some of the other races this year. In the race, he was just a few places behind Norris before his final stint, which again is promising for the driver that may have just 2 races left in his career. But in a moment of frustration, he made a desperate move down the inside of Yuki Tsunoda and simply shunted the AlphaTauri off the track and into the barrier. It was a dreadful move, and I just don't think there was ever the opportunity to make an overtake down the inside of the corner. It resulted in the Japanese driver's retirement and a deserved 10-second penalty for the Australian driver in my opinion. Perhaps it was a sign of how difficult he's been finding it in the McLaren car lately and how he's more desperate as he comes towards the end of his time with that team. But despite that move, on the soft tyres at the end after a long medium stint at the start, he looked so strong. He had a huge pace advantage over the cars around him, and after a team orders pass on Lando Norris, he was quickly past Bottas and Fernando Alonso, and was quickly past Esteban Ocon as well, with 9 laps remaining. There were signs of his former self with late-breaking moves, which meant he got himself into the best of the rest spot, and was then fighting to build that 10-second gap he needed to his competitors behind in order to secure those points in the fight with Alpine. The disappointing point for me is that it was clear that Ricciardo could make the overtakes on track without contact, which begs the question as to why he made the silly move on Tsunoda. In the end, he did manage to make up those 10 seconds on Esteban Ocon and held on to 7th position at the checkered flag. And this race shows that Ricciardo has still got it when he has confidence in his car, but his good performances have been so sporadic throughout this season and throughout his McLaren career. I think this result will have been a good advert for other teams in the future, other than perhaps the AlphaTauri team. So for me, it's got to be an amber box for Ricciardo. He got driver of the day, but that move is pretty inexcusable for me. Honourable mentions. I think Valtteri Bottas is deserving of an honourable mention today. He's managed to secure his first point since Canada, and that will be critical for Alfa Romeo in their battle with Aston Martin. So there we have it. The record has been broken by Verstappen, and he may well break it again before the end of the year.